Okay, lovely. Session 5, start of your chart work. What we'll go through is some dead reckoning and estimated position, including an awareness of leeway, some techniques of fixing, some satellite-driven positions and how that works, waypoints, how we use waypoints. Then we'll do a little bit on course to steer. So, dead reckoning. What is dead reckoning? Basically, your most basic form of navigation. Very, very basic. You start at 9 o'clock at position A, 9:30, you're there, 10 o'clock, you're there. If you're doing 10 knots, you know, that's the distance you covered, that's your course. That's a dead reckon. And it's very, very basic. It's just course, speed, time. It is the most common form of navigation. We use it crossing oceans all the time because you aren't in tide and you're usually going downwind. So very, very useful stuff, but the most simple. Okay, so the 030 degrees true, take that course and you will be there at 10 o'clock. This does not take wind, current and tide into account. So there's nothing, no other factors that are thrown in here. So obviously we've now got tide, we've got current, we've got all these other factors that influence where we are. So what happens if we put the wind where it is here? We're going to do that. So we'd have to take into account what the wind's doing to us. That could be tide or current, you know, not a problem, but we'd have to take it into account because we wouldn't be there, we'd be here at the end of the arrow. And obviously if you move the wind around, it would change how it affects you. You cannot forecast this accurately. So leeway, which is what we're talking about, there's no way to say, okay, the boat will lose course 5 degrees or 10 degrees. It is so boat dependent, it is so type of sea state dependent that you would literally have to judge it on your own boat. But it can be worked out in the past tense. So in other words, I know I steered that, but that's where I ended up. So that'll give you your leeway. So if you've got a boat, you can start developing how much leeway is going to go with what sort of sea state and what sort of wind speed. Very useful sort of course predictions. So I'm going to go, okay, I want to go from A to B here, and I know the wind's going to be doing this, so I'm going to steer that course so I end up there. So you could pre-change your courses that you want to do. If I put the wind here, you can see what happens to my leeway. It grows considerably. The moment you put the wind forward of your beam, so anywhere where it's bouncy and coming through from white sails from in front, you get a big change in leeway. So you'd have to literally do that for various points of sail. And slowly but surely you develop a really good idea of what certain boats can do. Unfortunately, leeway is very real and is way too often overlooked. People don't take it into account. They'll plan a course, not take it into account, and then end up in the wrong place. So it's very real and needs to be taken into account. Okay, so that's DR and leeway. Okay, that very, very simple bits and pieces. How do we actually know where point A, point B, etc. is? So visual fixing. If a buoy, like this one in this picture, is on a chart and you sail past it, that's the easiest fix you're going to get because you know you're next to that on a chart. You don't even have to do anything. There's no navigation involved. You know you've just sailed past this buoy. That's the easiest finding. It might be a rock, it might be a buoy, it might be a headland, the end of a harbor wall, doesn't matter. Just a fixed point. That'll give you a fix on a chart immediately. Taking bearings on objects, on fixed objects, that's another very easy way to get position. The use of a magnetic bearing to be able to plot a line from a known point. So if you look at your chart and you point this compass at the object on your chart, but in reality, it'll give you a bearing and you can draw that on the chart and you know you're somewhere on that line. So we use multiple bearings to create a position. So take a bearing on that fixed point in the chart, that fixed point, that fixed point. So we've got 3 points. We know we're in that triangle there. So that's called a 3-point fix. It's, again, a very, very common technique that we use a lot. Remember, you're moving. As you take these fixes, you're actually still sailing. So you don't have to worry that they don't meet up. So when you draw them on the chart, and you get something like this, or any of the dotted lines, don't worry about it. It's not a problem. You just put yourself closest to the danger. So if this was my 3-point fix, I would put myself there, so that even though I make a course to miss the headland, I'm never going to hit it. If I put myself here and the headland sticks out further, I could hit it. So you always put yourself closest to the danger. So you don't put yourself in the middle of the triangle. It's literally the point that's closest to land. And the reason we use 3 fixes is because if I took 2 fixes, the church and the headland, it's actually got me here. So by taking the third one, it gives me a triangle. I'm somewhere in that triangle, so I'm going to take the closest point to land. It'll also show you if there's an error immediately. So take the 3 fixes, and one of them is wildly out. You know something's gone wrong, you can do it again. Fix closest to land or to any danger. If there was a rock this side, somewhere here, I would have probably gone this side because the land would be further away. Bearing and depth. So here's our depth contour, and we're sailing around this headland. We take a bearing on that, that's him, we know we're there. Very, very quick. One bearing, look at the depth, there you are. So if we're going around this headland, the knowledge of where you are by your depth tells you you're out of danger. Because you can look at this and say, okay, there's my 10-meter contour and there's nothing to hit on it. So if I sail around this headland in the 10-meter contour, I'm never going to hit the bottom. So it's a very, very good way of navigating, and therefore a very quick way of getting fixes. Then you get transits, transit and a bearing. A transit is when you line up 2 objects. Now these are nice, pretty, a dot and a V, okay? A transit, a normal transit could be a church spire and a light on the water. As long as there are 2 objects on the chart, once they're in line, you are guaranteed 100% to be in that line. So you can see if the one behind, off to your port, if you're facing it, you would then turn that way and you'd line them up, and vice versa with the starboard one. They are a very, very safe and highly used system with all navigation. Transits are used all the time, right down to these chaps. Outside of Portsmouth, there were a whole bunch of these guys. That is for the new aircraft carrier to line itself up in transit to get in and out of the harbor. That's how much they're used. And if we looked at this one, we could say this pillar, once that's lined up with that buoy, we have a transit. The other way we can use them is just a simple glance. So if we line up that headland with that headland, we can sail into trouble. But we know we're safe on the outside, just tack out. Just by looking at the chart and going, we keep those 2 out of transit, we're safe. So it's a very simple navigation aid. It's a very simple way of just seeing things. Put a line on a chart, you know where you are, stay out of it. And you get something called the running fix. I'm not going to go into much detail with it, but what you use for when you have very few landmarks. So you time yourself and you get a different position. We're not going to go heavily into that now because it takes a while to get right. The thing with that running fix is it's not instant because you have to move. And the other thing is it can be used very effectively at nighttime when you've only got one lighthouse. The way it works is you sail here, take a bearing on your lighthouse, that's your course, there's your tide, take your second bearing, copy your first line, exactly where your second line is, there's your fix. Okay, when visual fixing, things to be aware. By maritime law, any commercial vessel in sight of land must perform a visual fix. In other words, they're going to use a hand bearing compass and a piece of paper, and they're going to get their fix from that rather than just looking at a GPS. The reason being is the chances of error are far, far slimmer. Errors show up far more easily than a GPS. Why is that? Keeps your navigational ability up, but when you're doing it on board, you also look super cool. The GPS system, okay, or GNSS, is basically a number of satellites in range of a certain point. So they're doing a 3-point fix from space. That's what they're doing. Or in this case, a 10-1, then a 9, then an 8, then a 7. So they're basically doing exactly the same thing that we did with the 3-point fix, but from space. And the number of satellites improves your fix. So it's all there. Different areas of the globe have better reception, and the speed of the update is not relevant to a marine vessel. Literally, the speed is not relevant to a marine vessel. We move slowly, so it just keeps up with us very easily. So we get instant information. We spoke about course over ground and speed over ground. Speed over ground, course over ground, and obviously a position. The way these two are derived is by your machine picking up where you've been. So it'll go, okay, you were there. So that was the course you were doing, and that's the speed you're doing. It doesn't know where you're pointing. That's your heading, that's your compass. It's saying what you've done, okay? Obviously, we can link it with all sorts of information on board with the instruments. A lot of them will have compasses built in, electronic compasses. They obviously can give you a heading, and then we can add instruments all over, giving you all sorts of information. But they're all based on that satellite system that comes from above. The pitfalls of it are, and this is the big thing, human error. Your Latin long is there. You're perfectly safe. You write that down. You write it down in a hurry on a bumpy boat in the sea with a head torch and you're not quite looking at everything. You write that down. You can almost not even notice it if you look at it. So have a look. So you plot that, you're about to hit land, or vice versa. It's a very, very easy human error mistake. Happens all the time, which is why the big ships are being told to use visual fixing, because you can pick up those errors. It's very easy to confuse numbers, and you do them at night on a bouncy boat, and you're tired, and you know, that's it. You've made an error, and you could put yourself in danger very, very easily. Okay, so what do we do with waypoints? Waypoints, okay? So a waypoint is just a position we've decided to make on a chart, and a list of them together makes a course. It's all they are. So we've got a known position, and then we can make a course around an island, literally just like that. Waypoint 1, waypoint 2, 3, 4, and so on. Nice and easy. When you plot them as accurately as possible. For obvious reasons, you want to know exactly where you put them. And the symbol for a waypoint is a cross with a square. So if you ever see that on a chart, it means it's a waypoint, not a position. Waypoints are guides. This is my planned course. It doesn't mean to say it's the route I'm going to actually follow this dotted line. It's just a guide. If you've got a hazard here, so the hazard in this case, where this course is going round, there's my hazard. That's not a problem. I could sail here, miss waypoint 1, hit waypoint 2, and sail out to waypoint 3. It's not an issue. Stay north, stay east of your whole course, and you're fine. If you start coming south of your course, it starts becoming a problem. So they're a guide. You don't have to follow these dotted lines. Now, if you imagine you're going into the wind, obviously you're going to have to zigzag. You're going to have to beat, go close haul to close haul. So you sail out from waypoint 1, like that, then you tack over. You can come down to waypoint 2, and then tack away again, and then come down again. So you're not actually following the dotted line, you're using it as you tack, as a guide to stay north and stay east as you tack. So it's not a hard and fast, I must follow that dotted line. Okay, so that gives us the question of, how do I follow that course? How do I follow that waypoint list that I've created to make a course? So we create courses to steer. Okay, so what we need for a course to steer is your start and finish positions. Well, we've done those waypoints. The tide, what's the speed and direction of your tide? Because that's what's going to influence you, and or leeway. What speed am I going to do? How long is it going to take me? And what speed am I going to do? So we want to go from point A to point B. Okay, this is the course over ground you want to achieve. But we have this tide going to push us down. We want to go that way, but the tide is going to push us southeast here. So we literally arc our distance off. Now, where do we get our distance from? That comes from our speed. If we're doing 6 miles an hour, we would arc off 6 miles. We have 1 hour of tide, 1 hour of boat speed. If we did half an hour of tide, we'd do half an hour of boat speed. If we did 2 hours of tide, we'd do 2 hours of boat speed. but we have to arc it off. So if I go back here, I would take my 6 knots of boat speed, say, arc it off there. I wouldn't go straight to B. Or I'd arc it off here, beyond B. B is just not relevant when you're working out this arc off. Measure your planned distance, and always on the latitude scale, remember, because longitude changes, and then arc off the distance from the end of your tide. Bingo. That gives you this heading. So just quickly, 1 arrow is your heading. That's where your boat's actually pointing. 2 arrows is your course over ground. 3 arrows is your tide. So those are standard on all charts. So you can see the little blue boat here. Although he's heading in that direction, he's countering the tide and following the course over ground. So it would look something like this when you're finished. There's your arc off. You're trying to get to B. It doesn't matter that you don't make it in this, but it gives you your heading, and that will take you 1 hour if we've used 1 hour of tide, 1 hour of boat speed. You'll get that far in 1 hour. You can add leeway. So if you believe you're going to have 10 degrees leeway, whichever way the wind's coming, counter it, add that in as well. Okay? So as I said, single arrow, that's your heading. That's your course to steer. That's what you're pointing the boat at. 2 arrows, that's what you're going over the ground. 3 arrows, tide. So it looks like this in the chart. So that's where we're there. There's our course over ground, and we want to go around that island. Okay? That's what the tide's doing to us. It's pushing us south like that. We arced off our boat speed, and that will be the direction we point our boat to hold that course over ground. So your course to steer is this arc off. And in doing so, you can then follow waypoint 1 to 2 to 3, etc., knowing that you're counteracting the tide. So that's a course to steer. So you can see the difference between the DR that we did right in the beginning, just point the boat in that direction, measure the time. That doesn't take into account anything else. Here we're saying we've got tide, it's taken into account, and then we'll head up. What happens if you've got multiple hours of tide? If you're going to cross the English Channel, it's going to take you 5 hours. Okay? 1 tide, 1 hour, 1 hour. Okay? The tide obviously changes. So you put 5 hours of tide together. At the end of that, 5 hours of boat speed, you hold that course to steer, you will end up at that point. You might be washed this way a little bit and then that way a little bit, but you'll get there. So you're just adding lots of tide together. Note 5 hours of tide, 5 hours of boat speed. You can go the other way. If you're doing a short leg, half hour of tide, half hour of boat speed. Okay, so very, very just scratching the surface. In the classroom, we do loads and loads and loads and loads of examples of these. We practice them like mad, and they become completely second nature. The CTS is in every exam, both day skipper and the offshore exam for everyone. And paper chart making is in your exam. You have to write and do all sorts of paper chart making. And obviously practice makes perfect.